Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, in my short presentation, I tried to give an answer to the question, where does human dignity come from? We all reject slavery, human trafficking, but are we sure that we are all aware where this rejection comes from? So in dealing with the dramatic issue of human trafficking, it seems necessary to go back to the source of the present universal rejection of human slavery and all forms of degrading treatment. The condemnation of human trafficking has deep roots in religion and culture. However, it is not shared by all cultures and religions. To find out where is the source of our present condemnation, we have to follow the steps of abolition of slavery, and more deeply, the anthropological views shared by communities who do not accept discrimination of human beings. Our purpose is to find out ways to eradicate the new appalling forms of human slavery. First point, rejection of slavery. The rejection of slavery was a long process. In ancient times, all civilizations admitted slavery, not only practically, but also with theoretical justification. The antique city was made up of few free men together with many slaves and affranchised. Women and youth under age had no civil or political rights either. From an economic point of view, distinctions are made between slave societies, where slave work was the main contribution to economic life, and societies with slaves, where compulsive work was admitted along with dominant free work. The first group ranges from the ancient Greek and Roman cities, Brazil, the colonial empires, and the southern states of America before the Secession War. To the second group belong the Western Middle Ages and the Arab world. To be distinguished from slavery as a status is the practice of slave trade or black trade in the 16th to 18th centuries, which involved slave suppliers in Africa, slave traders coming from European companies, and slave buyers in North, Central, and South America. Slave trade was the first practice to be formally rejected. Historians point out that the critique of slavery in the West came from the first economists, such as Adam Smith, arguing that free work is more productive than slave work. The same argument is developed by 18th century physiocrats, observing that a free worker shows interest in his job and does not need to be monitored. The cost of wages for free workers is lower than the cost of maintaining continued repression and surveillance of slave colonies. Moreover, economists stressed that the inner market needs to develop thanks to wages and salaries, and that slavery jeopardized technological progress. In France, for instance, slavery was abolished in 1794 after a slave revolt in the colonies, but was re-established by Napoleon in 1802. Black trade, which means trading of slaves sent to the colonies, was abolished by the Congress of Vienna in 1815, but not slavery as such. In the process of abolishment of slavery, economic and commercial considerations took an important place, yet some voices, like the Congress of Vienna, made reference to, I quote, the general principles of morality and humanity. Only later, on, in the 19th century, the European states abolished slavery in their colonies. Britain in 1833, France in 1848. Nevertheless, the trade continued for several decades and forced labor even later. In 1865, the US adopted the 13th Amendment prohibiting slavery, so engaging the country in the Civil War. The Brussels Conference of 1889 declared the intention of the European states to put an end to the traffic in African slaves. This proposal was restated after World War I. These intentions flowed into the Slavery Convention of Geneva, signed in September 1926. Herewith, not only slavery as such, defined as a condition of a person over whom rights of ownership are exercised, but also forced labor analogous to slavery was condemned. While abolishing the slave trade, the convention could only encourage the progressive and complete abolition of slavery in all its forms. The conventions, however, admitted that forced labor still could be exacted for public purposes. On 29th of June 1930, the General Conference on the International Labour Organization adopted a convention concerning forced or compulsory labor. It decided that after a period of 5 years, even forced or compulsory for public purposes, work for public purposes should be abolished. Forced or compulsory labor was understood as all work or service exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. Facing these issues, the afterwar philosophy of universal human rights definitely condemned slavery. Article 4 of the Universal Declaration states, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms, to be read in reference to the preamble of Article 1. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article 5, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. This text and those preceding ones bear magnificent witness to the evolution of humanity in matters of recognition of equal dignity of all. The Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the Slave Trade, and institutional practices similar to slavery adopted in April 1956 witnesses the impact of the new ethos of universal human rights, as it mentions the dignity and worth of the human person in the preamble. Now, all forms of slavery are condemned, including debt bondage, serfdom, forced marriage, child exploitation, slave trade, marking of persons of servile status. Where does that awareness come from? We should remind that behind the work of the Universal Declaration is the tremendous failure of civilized nations which engaged in the most inhuman ideologies of the 20th century, which ended up in the Second World War. The Declaration was a reaction to what appeared as absolutely unacceptable. To what extent did all the nations who signed this document share these views? Apparently, all national constitutions do not prohibit slavery. It is still admitted in some Islamic countries like the Arabic Peninsula, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, and also India. Some states in India practice discriminations of non-Hindus. In these cases, we face forms of survival of slavery as an accepted social status. Now, the new forms of slavery, in spite of all the efforts of the international community, the International Labour Organization observes that still about 25 million people in the world still live in slavery conditions in spite of legislation and human rights. Modern slavery has new features. It consists mainly in various forms of human trafficking, by which we understand any form of reduction of human being to an object, a merchandise, a thing to be used for the benefit of other human beings, an individual considered as ownership of somebody else to be sold or bought. The present situation ranges from kidnapping and forced and clandestine labor, forced marriage, selling of organs, compelled prostitution, servitude for debt, inducement in irregular immigration, deprivation of basic human rights, forms of submission, work of children, or enrollment of children in military operations. Among these new forms of slavery, Pope Francis, in his message of January 2015, further listed laborers in countries where legal protection for workers' rights is not guaranteed, migrants detained in inhumane conditions, those forced to leave clandestinely, those with legal residence, without legal residence, nor labor contract, slavery for debt, persons, even minors, forced into prostitutions, women forced into marriage, persons made object of trafficking for the sale of organs, for recruitment of soldiers, for begging, for production or sale of narcotics, those kidnapped and held kept captive by terrorist groups and used as sex slaves, and so on. On December 2014, together with other religious leaders, the Pope signed a joint declaration to eradicate modern slavery, stating that modern slavery in terms of human trafficking, forced labor and prostitution, organ trafficking, and any relationship that fails to respect the fundamental conviction that all people are equal and have the same freedom and dignity is a crime against humanity. This statement perfectly settles the problem. Where does the fundamental conviction come from? And do all cultures in the world share this conviction? It is obviously not the case. Not only criminal individuals or terrorist organizations, but also some states still admit or cover slavery in its antique form, making a person the ownership of another. Legislation does not everywhere combat slavery in its modern form. The conviction that all human persons share the same dignity manifested in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has the same roots than all efforts to bring an end to inhuman treatment inflicted to human beings. Last point, which I call conversion of minds. The new forms of slavery must be abolished in the same way as was abolished the antique slavery, through the adoption of a new vision of the human being and his dignity, through legislation, but also upstream of legislation, through education and conversion of minds. The process in the antique was the following. Starting from the Greek philosophers who considered the slaves as objects in the hands of their masters, as a thing rather than a being, coming down to the message of Christianity that all human beings are brothers and enjoying the same human nature, it took time indeed for the new understanding to induce changes in the social status of slaves. Slavery also existed in the Bible. The New Testament did not abolish slavery as social institution, but a new spirit emerged. My point is that our present awareness of the inalienable dignity of each human person comes from the message of the gospel. Interesting is moving from the Old to the New Testament. In Leviticus 19, there is a wonderful verse. You will not rob or exploit your fellow. But a few verses ahead, it continues saying, the male or female slaves you have will come from the nations around you. From these you may purchase male and female slaves. They will become your property, and you may leave them as a legacy to your sons after you as their perpetual possession. The Old Testament taught the law of God and of the neighbor, but the neighbor was exclusively the man of my tribe, a member of the community of Israel. The core of the teaching of the New Testament is love of God and the neighbor as Christ loved us. No discrimination at all. In Christ, distinctions between Greeks and barbarians, between free and slaves are abolished. This means that there is only one human family, one human condition that all share in their differences. St. Paul says, we are baptized into one body in a single spirit, Jews as well as Greeks, slaves as well as free men. The short letter of St. Paul to Philemon exemplarizes the change of view about the dignity of slaves. Philemon had a slave named Onesimus. Philemon was a fellow Christian, and Onesimus, who escaped from Philemon's house, converted also to Christianity. St. Paul asked Philemon to take him back, not as a slave, but as a dear brother. As Paul puts it elsewhere, becoming a Christian meant giving up social prejudices and considering that in Christ we are all one. The change was anthropological, but did not affect immediately the social status of slaves. This change, in considering the worth of the person, did not mean abolition of the institution of slavery. It took centuries before the social context was major to give up slavery as a social status. The Church did not provoke institutional changes, even if she did no longer justify slavery as did the Greek and Roman philosophers. Institutional changes came with a more incisive consciousness of the principles brought to light by the gospel. I could remind of a symptomatic episode that took place in Rome by the end of the 6th century. Pope Gregory the Great quietly discovered on the marketplace in Rome prisoners from Anglia, sold as slaves. He did not seem to be scandalized at this traffic. Instead, he indulged himself in a dubious joke. He found that these angels were like angels, angli, angeli, because they had blonde hair and blue eyes. It seems that the Catholic Church always questioned the anthropological assumptions which justified slavery. There is no such a statement like the Dutch Calvinist Church enforcing apartheid with biblical references. On various occasions, the Church helped slavery and serfdom to disappear from current practices. There is an interesting remark in one of Emperor Constantine's laws. He forbids branding slaves in order not to disfigure their face which reflects the image of God. In the Middle Ages, the Church came across the practice of arranged marriages and the prohibition of marriage between freemen and serfs, imposing the rule of the free consent given by both partners. A new challenge came up with the European colonization of America in the famous dispute of Valladolid about the very nature of the indigenous Indians. Pope Paul III condemned the opposite thesis, stating, "Are these Indians not human beings? Do they not have reason and soul? Are we not bound to love them as much as ourselves?" Before the 20th century, the defense of the common humanity was rarely illustrated with the concept of dignity. Yet the concept of dignity appears in Pope Leo III's encyclical Rerum Novarum. In his defense of industrial workers, he stressed the necessity of state intervention in order to protect the well-being of their soul. I quote, "It is not permitted to anybody to violate this dignity of man, which God himself treats with high respect, a dignity understood as dignity of human nature." Dignity emerges as a key concept of the social doctrine of the Church with John XXIII and his encyclical Pacem in Terris. It is further elaborated by the Second Vatican Council. It is interesting to observe that the first hints of the magisterium at the concept of freedom of conscience and religion was made in defense of believers under totalitarian regimes. Pius XI does not draw these human rights from human dignity, but from the negation of such human dignity. In his radio messages pronounced during the war, Pius XII frequently uses the concept of human dignity. Things have changed after 1960. The encyclical of John XXIII, Mater et Magistra, which says that in the first place of the true values of a just social order, one has to mention the dignity of the human person in general and the life of each person in particular. The concept is then further developed in Pacem in Terris and the Constitution Gaudium et Spes of the Council. I come to the conclusion. The question we still face today is that slavery in its modern form cannot be abolished only by laws, but by conversion of minds. Slavery must disappear from human imagination as a means of exploitation of others. This means a cultural conversion in some places and a powerful enforcement of the universal ethical values as expressed in the Declaration of 1948. This declaration is in no way obsolete. It should serve as a program of education and formation for all generations all over the world. Modern slavery is mainly fostered today by two kinds of actors. On the one hand, criminal states, and on the other hand, criminal organizations and individuals. Both should be repressed by states under the rule of law everywhere in the world. On the side of repression, a special mention must be made about the recent appalling practices of Islamic terrorism, mainly in what is called Daesh, a self-proclaimed Islamic State, and in parallel organizations like Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram, operating in Africa and spreading terrorism everywhere, as in Paris in January of this year. Radical Islamic terrorists claim to act under Islamic law or Sharia. This law is understood by them in such a way that it urges followers to combat misbelievers, to oppress them, to kill them if necessary, and to submit them as slaves by conquest, just as in ancient times. There is a tremendous gap between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Daesh ideology. The international community has a duty to prevent or repress any attempt to question the fundamental human rights, which proclaims that all men and women are equal and vested with the same dignity. There can be neither compulsion nor intimidation in religion. A state order must respect the inherent limits of its mission, which is to protect the inalienable rights of individuals and to guarantee freedom of religion. Repression has also to be exercised against criminal organizations or individuals who make profit with the misfortune or weakness of others. This means that state legislation be enforced and duly implemented as it fights against corruption. Human trafficking is also a consequence of poverty and economic failure, when too many people are practically excluded from access to work and to autonomy. My point is that human trafficking must be addressed at its heart by education and return to the source of human dignity. This source is for me the message of the gospel. All men and women are radically equal in dignity and worth. No human being may be treated as an object or a means. Each one is an end in itself. This consideration implies that rejection of human trafficking begins with a conversion of minds. This conversion must be shared by the entire human community through active campaigns of information at national and international level. Legislation will follow and pursue traffickers, but conversion of minds also means fostering action on the causes of human trafficking, such as extreme poverty, illegal immigration, and administrative corruption. I thank you.